Welcome. Live at UN headquarters in New York right now. A special session is just beginning involving the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, who is today beginning proceedings at UN headquarters. Very unusual proceedings because they're being billed as a youth takeover. The idea is that young people around the world are going to talk about education and the barriers to it. This is what we're seeing live from UN headquarters right now. Malala Yousafzai, the campaigner who was shot and nearly killed by the Taliban in Pakistan, is going to be speaking live in a moment. She's been brought to the UN by the global envoy for education, the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who is speaking right now. So we will be bringing you live coverage of this in just a moment. But first, let's just give you a sense of what the global picture in terms of access to education for both girls and boys is like, because it is a pretty shocking picture. In all, 57 million children worldwide are out of school. More than half of them live in conflict-affected countries. One of the other biggest barriers, as you might imagine, is poverty. Nigeria, Pakistan and Ethiopia have the worst records in terms of numbers of children who are out of school, although of those three, Ethiopia is said to be making substantial progress. Well, Malala's story has highlighted and also personalised the struggle for education, so much so that the UN has designated this Malala Day. Our Pakistan correspondent has been following this journey closely, and we're going to be talking about this throughout the programme. With me to discuss education around the world are a panel of guests. BBC journalist Nel Hedayat, who has lived in both Afghanistan and Pakistan and also made a documentary on this issue. Lorraine Dodge, a former head teacher who spent 2 years volunteering in Nepal as an education advisor. Imtiaz Dossa from the Citizens Foundation charity, which runs nearly 1,000 schools in Pakistan. And Samson Kambalu, an artist who has written about his childhood being educated in Malawi. Welcome to you all. Samson, start by just telling us about your education in Malawi, because it's worth remembering that although Malala's story is about South Asia and a very extreme example, many of the out-of-school children we're talking about are in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, well, of course, it's a poor part of the world. It's a very poor part. And the education is like in the extremes. You start off in primary school, like in my case, we started education under a tree. You walk long distance and you go do everything under a tree, and you learn your lessons, you write on broken pieces of slate, for instance. And then from then you progress into the classroom. And the classrooms are usually crowded, and so it was a kind of, you could tell that education made all the difference. Education was so valued because what education does, the difference it makes was all around you. If you couldn't read or write, you knew where you would end up, and if you
It was your chance. It was your chance for a better life.
That's right.
I mean, when you talk about extremes of education, you ended up then at a school that is widely regarded as the Eton of Africa.
That's right.
How did that come about?
At the age of 13, 14, there were exams, so it was open to all the pupils of like the country. So you competed up and down the country, and they used to select 3 pupils from every district. And so what you did was to spend a year studying night and day, trying to get in. Yeah. And then once you got in, it was like a lottery, you know. And I remember when I got selected to go to this school, a friend of mine, from now on, all that's wrong with the world you only see on TV. So, yeah, I was lucky.
Yeah. Lorraine Dodge, I mean, you were a head teacher in Britain, and then you decided to take your skills abroad. Where did you go and what did you find when you got there?
I volunteered with VSO and I went to Nepal for 2 years. It's a very different culture, it's a very different way of training teachers, and it's a very different education system. So in the schools that I went to, I was met with a lot of enthusiasm for education. people in the education office just want to know so much, and they want their children to achieve. And that seemed to be a really strong thrust in the areas that I was working with. So I could work with the education office, and they wanted to know about the management structures so that they could support their head teachers in school, and so that they could also enable the head teachers to support the teachers who are working in the schools on an everyday basis.
Yeah, of course, there's so many more issues, aren't there, surrounding education, teacher training, all those kinds of things. I want to turn now to Imtiaz Dossa, because you represent the Citizens Foundation, which has a remarkable record of building and operating schools in Pakistan. Does the kind of thirst for education exist in a country where we know from Malala's story, getting girls into school is so difficult?
I think there is an insatiable appetite for education, not just boys but girls as well. I think parents everywhere, really, in Pakistan certainly, and in fact in the more traditional, conservative, poorer communities, know that education is the only real route, the only real escape, if you like, out of the poverty in which they find themselves. So yes, I think there is an insatiable demand for education. There isn't, of course, the supply, but there is undoubtedly.
But if they have limited resources, would they rather educate their sons than their daughters?
Yes, I would say there is this issue of, sons having priorities, and I think that in our own case, we in our fee structure, which is heavily subsidized, we do skew it in favor of girls, so that if you've got girls and boys, if you've got sons and daughters, we do make the daughters much cheaper to educate, so that parents will
so
have an incentive. I know it's just a way of, because for us a key requirement is that we have 50% girls, and for that this is one of
you have to work actively then to make that happen.
Yes.
Nel, what have you seen? Because you've made a whole documentary on this subject. What did you see when you filmed in Pakistan?
The thirst you guys have been speaking about is completely and utterly, like, it's everywhere in Pakistan. I went to a few places. I went to Karachi, I went to Islamabad, I went to Swabi, and everywhere I went there were little kids who were just absolutely desperate to get to school. Now, I was born in Kabul in Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world. So my family who are still there, I know firsthand, just like Samson, how important it is for them to go to school. But the problem is people in the Western world, people in the UK, can't really grasp that. They don't quite understand, because everyone goes to school here. It's completely normal and acceptable. But like Samson said, and I completely agree, for them, it's a way out of poverty. It's a way to better themselves. It's sometimes the only way they have to actually make a life for themselves. The only reason, for example, I'm here, I was able to come here, was because my mum knew that the only way to get me an education wasn't in a country run by the Taliban, but it was to come to the UK and get one, and that's what I did.
Yeah, but so we can all agree that the thirst is there, but it is so sobering when you think of the numbers. 57 million children, Samson, who don't have any access to school. I guess, there isn't a question, isn't there, about whether you go for a quality education or whether you just try and get as many of those children as possible into some kind of schooling, whatever the quality?
I think that it's good. I think everybody should have a right to a basic education. I think, and what I'm talking about here is actually competition for basic education. Fine, I went to a prestigious school, but for the majority of the people, it was a struggle even to just get basic education. Because when I was growing up, you had to pay. It's free now, but you had to pay, and many couldn't afford, so they dropped out. Of the about 70% of kids who used to go to school, about 50% of those who enrolled would end up, dropping out maybe in the third year or something. So in terms of luxury, education as a luxury, that's another story. But yeah. I think that we in Southern Africa are still struggling with basic education.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get more thoughts from everyone on the panel shortly, but I just want to go to the UN, because actually we are very close to hearing this speech from Malala Yousafzai. Remember, we haven't seen much of her at all since she was discharged from hospital. This is certainly the first time that she's going to be delivering a major speech, one of the very few times we'll have seen her at all since she was discharged from hospital. So live now to the UN, because our correspondent Rajini Vajanathan is standing by. She is going to be addressing the question of access to education, Rajini, in this speech.
That's right. what's going to be happening today is all the young people who are gathering here, more than 500 from more than 80 countries, will also get together and, along with Malala Yousafzai, come up with a proposal which will be put forward to the Secretary General. And Malala Yousafzai is expected to talk about her dream for a universal education. As you said before, Michelle, some 57 million children out of school around the world. And also put a proposal forward to guarantee that every child has at least 9 years in school. But of course, as you've been discussing just there, some of the issues relate to mindset as well. We've heard from Gordon Brown, the UN Special Envoy on Education just now. He's been speaking in the chamber, and he described the situation at the moment as an education emergency. And he talked about the issues of child marriage and also the other cultural issues that people face. He said there's also 4 billion shortage of classrooms around the world. But the other thing I've picked up from speaking to some of the young people here over the past few days is that it's not just about getting a place in school, but it's also about getting to school. I've met young people here who say it takes them 2 or 3 hours, some travelling from rural areas, to actually make it to the classroom. Others who say that their journey is fraught with problems, men harassing them, catcalling at them, giving them problems as they try and get to school.
Rajini, stay with us, and we'll bring the live coverage from the UN just as soon as Malala starts speaking. But I just want to get a thought from Lorraine Dodge, because you worked in Nepal for some time. Lorraine, what, in your experience, what was the biggest barrier to primary education there?
I think the biggest barrier was actually keeping children in school, because when you spoke earlier about should we have quality education or any education, I think you just have to remember that some of these very young children are working in really dangerous occupations, and if we can take them away from them and put them into safe places to begin with, then I think we can build up the quality of the education.
So anything that you do in an educational framework is better than the lives that they're living?
I would argue so, but importantly for families, you have to remember that those children who are working, they need that. There is such a high level of poverty that all members of the family have to contribute to that lifestyle. So education is such a great luxury, I think, for some of these families. And some of the families make great contributions. They are getting themselves in huge levels of debts. They owe money to banks, to money lenders, to enable their children to go to school. So they deserve and they should have a quality education, but which is developing. It doesn't all have to start now, but we should be slowly working towards that.
Yeah. Well, let's return now to Rajini at the UN. It's sobering, Rajini, to think that while progress has been made on so many other development goals, it does feel as if the pace of progress on education is slower, even though overall the trend is going in the right direction.
That's right, and it's not just about the statistics. I think the mood as well, and what this whole event here, this UN Youth Takeover, has given certainly the young people here is a sense of confidence that things can actually change. It is sad that this has only really come to global attention in the way it has because of the events that unfolded last year and what's happened to Malala Yousafzai. But there is a lot of positive energy here that such a tragic incident that happened to her has now been turned into something hugely positive and something that young people can focus on. And one thing that's really a takeaway from this whole event is that she is being seen as a real role model to people from, as I say, more than 80 countries around the world. So many different people who can share that same quest and goal to better and improve access to education for not just women, of course, but also everyone, boys and girls around the world. And that is something that I think will hopefully give some energy to the campaign, to political as well as obviously just practical measures to try and ensure that more people have access to a school and to a classroom.
Well, Malala Yousafzai is sitting there listening at the UN. She hasn't been introduced as yet, but we'll carry her speech live just as soon as she begins speaking. Nel Hedayat, in your filming in Pakistan, did people talk about Malala? Was she viewed as a role model?
She was viewed as a role model to some, but to others. I mean, I spoke to Shainat and over there, when I was over there, I spoke to the other 2 girls that were also injured in the attack. But the problem is that lots of people are scared. lots of people are scared that, lots of mothers and fathers are scared to send their kids to school because they've seen what's happened to Malala. And the Taliban knew what they were doing when they did that. The point is fear. The point is that they want an entire community, an entire village. I'm sure you've seen this. They want people to be petrified, absolutely terrified to send their kids to school. And another thing is I'm not sure I completely agree that any education is the right way forward. Some of these places, some of these schools in Pakistan do have basic education, but these kids, these girls are competing on a global level. And the problem is when they finish primary school, when they finish secondary school, they are nowhere near sort of the levels they need to be on par with, say, the UK or even China or anywhere. So it's not a case of just basic education. They've got to get good education.
Well, let's ask Imtiaz Dossa what you think of the quality versus quantity argument, if you like, because your schools have a really good record, but the numbers that you can educate are small compared to the need in Pakistan.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, we have a model which is extremely economical, which produces superlative quality of education. And I think part of what TCF is about is to have a template which is capable of being rolled out right across the country, because we have 910 schools, across all the 4 provinces. If a government was to ever have the will to want to provide good basic education right across the country, the TCF template, the TCF model is there. So you can have, if you run things properly, our education is, of course, run on very, very strict, transparent lines.
What is your attendance like? Because attendance is often a difficulty.
Is very high. I mean, the children there know that this is, the route. This is, it's a wonderful environment. The teachers are highly motivated. The head teachers are wonderful. The salaries we pay our teachers are half the level what the government pays, and yet our outputs are and our outcomes are 50, 60, 80% higher than the rest of the state sector.
It sounds like you've got it worked out, but the numbers you are able to reach are tiny compared to the millions of children in Pakistan who don't have an education.
That is absolutely true. So all we can do is, we have 910 schools. Pakistan has 150,000 schools. All we can do is provide a template and hope and pray that one day the government will see the light, will have the will, and want to roll out, these standard good quality schools right across the country.
If I could just interject, it's also about the will of the people. It's fine to say, the governments need to get behind this, and I'm sure Malala's going to stand up and say this, that it's got to be a global effort. But at the end of the day, we're talking about ideology. We're talking about changing mindsets. In the KPK region alone, we're talking about very conservative people. So the fight isn't just about building more schools. Building more schools is important, but not as important as getting the girls there. And ideology is a big factor in that.
Samson Kambalu, I mean, you don't have the ideological battle in sub-Saharan Africa that they're talking about there. What would make a real difference to the community that you grew up in Malawi?
To start with, I think a good basic education. When I was growing up, the emphasis was on the academic. You prepare yourself academically. Now the emphasis on practical education, like farming, etc. But not everybody can become a farmer. So that has an effect of degrading the quality of the education. I mean, you can see it in my family. The spectrum. I grew up in a family of 8, and amongst this, you can see the literacy rate kind of going down, if you like.
Really?
Yes, I think it was much more rigorous when I was growing up, and then by the time the siblings that came after me, the emphasis.
So you can see the difference within your family.